Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Brookings Institution. My name is John Allen, and I'm the president of Brookings. And it's my distinct pleasure today to be joined by my friend John F. Sopko, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, as we have shortened it to save time. John joins us as part of our event today entitled Afghanistan Lessons from the U.S. Experience, Stabilization, Lessons from the U.S. Experience in Afghanistan. This event happens to share the same title with the report just issued by SIGAR, which will be rolled out today. And you'll be hearing from John shortly on the report's contents, the findings, and the recommendations. Now, I've had the honor of knowing this gentleman, John Sopko, for many years, and he was a vital partner to me in my previous role leading U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, and has been a trusted advisor to many U.S. policymakers and leaders throughout the years. He and his team have maintained close and tireless oversight over our mission in Afghanistan and have been a critical part of ensuring we remain accountable for our efforts, and equally as important, in making sure we learn from our successes as well as our mistakes. And frankly, over the last nearly 17 years of this conflict, there's been much to learn. To the audience for this hour, John will first provide us his own set of remarks laying out the report. Then we'll come together on the stage for roughly about 30 minutes of conversation, which will be a short period of Q&A between him and me. And I think we'll have enough time in that hour to go out to the audience for a couple of questions. But we'll be followed by a panel that will have a discussion on the report and Afghanistan writ large, which, given the caliber of the panelists that we have today, will undoubtedly be an excellent discussion and not without some pointed views. And it will be during that period of time where we'll have about 30 minutes probably for audience questions and answers. And finally, I would be remiss in not noting that this event takes place just a few days before our most solemn and important of American holidays, Memorial Day. And while over 2,000 U.S. servicemen and women have made the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan since 2001, what's often overlooked and sometimes even forgotten are the sacrifices by our many foreign service officers, USAID professionals, and civilians of all stripes and forms, as well as our numerous coalition partners and allies who also gave their lives in the name of peace and security for the people of Afghanistan. Memorial Day is about honoring each of these heroes, and we must never forget them and their sacrifices. Those lives lost must mean something. And indeed, through the lessons learned reports of organizations like SIGAR, we can and we must find new and better ways to ensure that our missions are achieved with greater effect and with less sacrifice, less suffering, and less waste for all parties. So with that, let me welcome John Sopko, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, to the stage for his keynote remarks. John?
Good morning, and General, thank you for those very kind remarks and that introduction, and more importantly for hosting today's event and the release of our fourth Lessons Learned report, which is entitled Stabilization's Lessons from the U.S. Experience in Afghanistan. This report is the culmination of 2 years of work by our office and examines the U.S. stabilization efforts in Afghanistan, detailing how USAID, the State Department, and the Defense Department tried to support and legitimize the Afghan government in contested districts in Afghanistan from 2002 to 2017. Today's report is also available in an interactive format, and like all of our products, may be downloaded from our website at www.sigar.mil. Actually, on the interactive format, I think we're the only Inspector General's office that releases reports in such a format. Now, SIGAR will be releasing its 5th Lessons Learned report on June 14th, focusing on our counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan for those who are interested. We began our Lessons Learned program in late 2014 at a suggestion by you, General Allen, and also Ryan Crocker and some others. My staff has told me that I have credited you enough times about our Lessons Learned program that we should probably start writing you some royalty checks. But, but that would be wrong. But in all seriousness, you made an observation that resonated with me during one of my first trips to Afghanistan, while you were the commanding general of ISAF. And we later followed up on that after you retired at a little breakfast meeting over in Pentagon City. You noted that of all the worthwhile audits and investigations that SIGAR was conducting, there was still a question left unanswered. What did it all mean? And what did it all mean in the larger context of Reconstruction and national security? Part of the reason you and others thought that Lessons Learned program would be a worthwhile endeavor for my organization to undertake is due to our unique jurisdiction. Of all the IGs, we have jurisdiction to look at all U.S. Reconstruction programs and projects in Afghanistan, regardless of their funding source and regardless of which agency is actually conducting those programs. We are statutorily unique in that fashion, since we are the only federal oversight agency that can look holistically at the whole of government effort in Afghanistan, which means we are not constrained by agency stovepipes. I'm pleased to say that there has been great interest in our Lessons Learned reports up to date, and today's report is really no different. While we were finalizing our report, the Departments of State and Defense, along with USAID, were finalizing their own Stabilization Assistance Review, or SAR, and they asked SIGAR to brief their staffs on that work. Their interagency review was recently approved and is well aligned with the SIGAR report that we are releasing today. But before I go any further, I think we have to ask the question is, what is stabilization? It is one of those terms that is rarely, if ever, precisely defined. While definitions have varied by U.S. agency and even within a particular U.S. agency over the last 17 years we've been in Afghanistan, earlier this year, the U.S. government finally defined stabilization as, quote, a political endeavor involving a civilian military process to create conditions where locally legitimate authorities and systems can peaceably manage conflict and prevent a resurgence of violence. But put simply, stabilization is the process of building sufficient governance to keep insurgents from returning and convincing the population of that area that government rule is preferable to insurgent rule. SIGAR undertook this project for one simple reason. The stabilization effort in Afghanistan was not the first the U.S. government has undertaken, nor will it be the last. Given the current security environment and the dangers of allowing poorly governed spaces to serve as launching pads for transnational terrorist groups, we anticipate future U.S. government efforts to stabilize those areas by clearing them of terrorist groups and helping generate sufficient governance to keep terrorists from returning, not only in Afghanistan, but around the globe. And I believe the panel discussion this morning will go into greater detail about that. Today's report contains 7 findings identifies 10 lessons, makes 7 recommendations to the executive branch, and includes 4 matters for congressional consideration. Rather than go through every one of these, I would like to begin with our overall assessment of the stabilization effort in Afghanistan and then highlight some issues of particular concern. Unfortunately, SIGAR's overall assessment is that despite some very heroic efforts to stabilize insecure and contested areas in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2017, the program was mostly a failure. This happened for a number of reasons, including the establishment of a set of unrealistic expectations about what we could do and what could be achieved in just a few years' time. The lack of capacity of U.S. government agencies to fully support those accelerated efforts, and institutional rivalries and bureaucratic hurdles compounded this already difficult task. Every organization and agency we found that worked on stabilization in Afghanistan, from DoD Civil Affairs and Special Operation Forces to state and USAID, suffered from personnel and programming deficits, born from rapid scaling, short tours of duty, and the pressure to show quick progress. No organization we found was prepared for these challenges, and unfortunately it showed with the results. Stabilization is unique because it's an inherently joint civilian-military undertaking. Yet given the size and resources of DoD, the military consistently determined priorities on the ground and chose to focus on the most insecure districts. A logical decision on its face, but ironically one that had unintended negative consequences. Why? Because those areas often remained perpetually insecure and had to be cleared of insurgents again and again. Civilian agencies, particularly USAID, were compelled to conduct programs in these fiercely contested areas that were not ready for stabilization. Because the coalition focused on the most insecure areas and rarely provided enduring security after clearing them, Afghans were often too afraid to serve in the local governments there. Afghan civilians also had little faith that their districts would remain in government hands when the coalition withdrew. Implementing partners struggled to execute programs amidst the violence, and U.S. agencies were unable to adequately monitor and evaluate the projects. And we spend a lot of time in our report on that particular issue. One of the challenges facing stabilization efforts in Afghanistan, as I alluded to, and as it's reported in our report today, came from the institutional differences and rivalries that start right here in Washington. While the military was focused on clear, hold, and build, those are tenets of the COIN doctrine, state and USAID faced challenges given the pressure from DoD to quickly show gains on the ground. This led to significant tensions between USAID and the military over aid's reluctance or inability to work in the most contested and insecure districts, the same areas the military believed to be the most important to reverse Taliban momentum. Often the military would claim a district was cleared and thus ready for aid to start stabilization programs. Yet clear meant something very different to the military than it did to aid and the Afghan contractors tasked with, for example, paving a road in an insecure environment. The military may have deemed the area safe enough for them, but it made little difference if the contractors charged with executing the hold or build phase of stabilization effort were in danger or felt they were so. Some senior aid officials told our staff that coalition military forces pushed the agency into going along with clear hold and build and demanded that it implement programs such as cash for work on a large scale over aid's objections. Senior military officials likewise told us that they had little choice but to do things quickly and focus on the most dangerous areas. Again, you have to remember the timeline, the short timeline that the military was given, particularly as it was drawing down resources. USAID officials also had a difficult time arguing against the military's belief that stabilization would buy the support of the population, convince them to share information about IEDs, and thus save coalition lives. As one aid official told us, quote, "The military expected us to be bags of cash," unquote. Prior to the surge, aid advisors were often able to exercise veto power about where and how military commanders used funds, particularly from the SERP program, or Commander's Emergency Response Program. But later, USAID's influence over SERP expenditures were significantly diminished as we were doing that drawdown and that quick exit from Afghanistan. As one official noted, when aid tried to stop implementing projects in areas where they could not be monitored or evaluated, the military sometimes set aside the CivMil partnership model and used SERP funding unilaterally. As a result, all types of stabilization programming were implemented during all stages of the clear, hold, and build sequence, even when aid knew the sequencing was inappropriate and the programs would be ineffective. Under pressure from the military, the aid built schools in places where they cannot be monitored, the government could not maintain and staff them, and students only attended sporadically, if at all, due to insecurity. Military commanders likewise concentrated large SERP projects in less secure areas where they were less likely to succeed. In contrast to DoD, state and aid, the two agencies that provided the most personnel for the civilian surge, did not have sufficient staffing, especially built-in staff redundancy, to enable rapid mobilization in the field. Without that capacity in Afghanistan, state and aid particularly struggled. To meet the demands of the civilian surge, state and aid pulled staff from the other assignments and hired temporary staff. The number of civilian personnel under Embassy Kabul's control, for example, more than tripled between January 2009 and December 2011. Astoundingly, by 2011, more than 20% of USAID's worldwide staff were in Afghanistan. As one aid official told SIGAR, at the height of the civilian surge, our existing numbers were so limited, we were forced to bring on roughly 250 to 350 people per year to do the work of aid across Afghanistan. Unfortunately, many had no or little practical aid experience. One of the hires told our staff that he got the job because, quote, "I had a pulse and a master's degree," unquote. By 2011, the demand for personnel had so exceeded the supply that state and aid were unable to hire enough people to fill all of the civilian slots that coalition military forces requested, even with the hiring of temporary employees. Now, I would like to say one thing before I get some water. Unfortunately, I'm a little parched. Excuse me. I apologize. I should grab this at the beginning. As I said, the use of temporary hires by aid and state actually had both positive and negative trade-offs. On the positive side, unlike permanent aid and state personnel, temporary hires could stay in Afghanistan more than 1 year, avoiding the loss of institutional memory, or what I and my staff call the quote-unquote annual lobotomy that occurs when personnel rotate out of the country after 1 year or less. Unfortunately, those same temporary hires had little, if any, experience or training in monitoring and project oversight and carrying out specific aid projects. As a result, we were astounded to find out that few of those civilians working at the local level had agency authority to oversee programming. At one point, USAID's regional representatives, who are the most senior USAID officials assigned to each regional command in Afghanistan, had no oversight authority over the programs in their area of operations. Decisions, therefore, had to default to the embassy in Kabul, which had problems, obviously, of communicating quickly to the staff in the field. Contracting also surged. At one point, a high-ranking aid official determined that in order to meet the U.S. government average ratio of dollars to the number of contracting officials, aid would have to send nearly its entire overseas workforce to Afghanistan. The number of contractor personnel overseen by direct hire state and aid personnel was extremely large. In 2011, there were approximately 18 contractors for every direct hire at state, and the ratio was 100 to 1 at USAID. Now, even with sufficient number of highly trained personnel, stabilization operations in Afghanistan would have been challenging. Unfortunately, as our report lays out, state and aid did not have the right personnel to effectively execute the mission, in spite of efforts made years earlier to provide them with exactly that capability. Now, despite all of this, and despite all of those other challenges, the question ultimately we ask is, did stabilization in Afghanistan work, and was it effective? Did it meet its goal? You know, we talk a lot about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Did it reach that ultimate outcome? Now, as our report lays out, we tried to answer that question by looking at other experts who had studied the issue. And external research reviewed by SIGAR unfortunately found that the evidence is inconclusive and sometimes exactly contradictory. Some research found that USAID and the State Department programming actually did accomplish stabilization. Some found no impact, and other research, ironically, found that the program itself was destabilizing. There are some factors that seem to be common among, however, the most successful stabilization interventions in Afghanistan, and those are laid out in the report, and actually we have on the panel following us a military leader who actually we highlight as one of the leaders who actually succeeded in stabilization in his district in Kunar. But what did we find were the common lessons learned, the common best practices for stabilization to work? First, we found out that stabilization was most effective in areas where the government had a degree of physical control. Second, it was also more successful when implementers undertook fewer activities with a higher degree of oversight, flexibility, and staffing. Third, stabilization could not be done well on the cheap. Successful projects were labor-intensive for donors and implementing partners alike. Fourth, we found at best it results in small gains that require constant reinforcement to avoid reversals. The timelines that U.S. agencies were operating under assumed that quick security gains would be matched by equally quick stabilization and governance gains. The latter failed to materialize before security forces withdrew and instability returned to many of the areas where stabilization programs were working. Our research also found that implementing smaller projects helped programs avoid some of the common pitfalls of working in the midst of a counterinsurgency. Avoiding these pitfalls of stabilization, such as predatory officials, corruption, and insurgent sabotage, while still providing tangible benefits to communities, was easier for smaller-scale projects. According to a 2010 U.S. Embassy assessment, it was also easier to ensure community buy-in and ownership of small-scale infrastructure projects than it was for large ones. As SIGAR has identified previously, research has demonstrated that superficial measures of success, such as sheer amount of money spent or outputs produced, had no correlation to the eventual impact or outcome. As one senior USAID official told us, quote, "If you go fast, you actually go slow. If you go slow on purpose, you actually go faster with stabilization," unquote. One area where U.S. efforts seemed to get it right was in Kunar province. The panel discussion, as I mentioned, will go into that example in greater detail. But a combination of capable individuals in key roles, a willingness by those individuals to collaborate, and a heavy presence of U.S. military forces in the area helped that initiative succeed more than others in the country. So, in conclusion, I have identified only a few of the major challenges the effort to stabilize Afghanistan faced. The poor results of this particular mission may make it tempting to some policymakers to conclude that stabilization should never be undertaken again. I would disagree with that. Given the security challenges we face in today's world, stabilization, or whatever you want to call it, is important. Eliminating that ability or capability is not a realistic choice. Rather, the U.S. government must address the challenges and capacity constraints identified in our report. Given the lack of alternatives to stabilization in an ungoverned space that has been cleared of insurgents or terrorists, the best course of action may be for the U.S. government to balance the importance of any stabilization mission with a realistic understanding of the level of effort required and what is achievable. Additionally, our government must improve its ability to prepare for, design, execute, monitor, and evaluate stabilization missions. The need for such expertise will not diminish anytime soon. As military historian Max Boot writes, quote, "While the tools of warfare have changed, the challenges of small wars fought against guerrillas and terrorists have remained constant. American soldiers struggling against al-Qaeda and the Taliban could profitably study the past to learn how their ancestors dealt with Haitian Caco, Philippine insurrectos, Nicaraguan Sandinistas, and other irregular foes," unquote. Just as with the examples that Max Boot references, we cannot afford to fail to absorb the lessons we've learned in Afghanistan as we continue to contemplate such programs both there in Afghanistan and in other countries in the future. Let me conclude by acknowledging the tireless efforts of those who worked on this report. SIGAR's efforts were led by David Young, who was supported by Jordan Kane, Paul Kane, Jordan Schurter, Olivia Peck, and Elizabeth Young, under the leadership of Program Director Joe Windram. They have my thanks and hopefully your thanks for issuing the report today. And with that, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
I'm sure some of you are seeing on your phones that there's a apparent announcement that the White House has just canceled the conversation with the North Koreans coming up. So we'll see how that develops today. Someplace where I don't think we were going to have a stabilization effort in the near future. John, thank you for those comments. I really appreciate them. Let me just make a real quick editorial note. On the panel, as John mentioned, we'll have an Army officer by the name of Vowell, who was a fellow here last year at Brookings. Kunar Province was one of the toughest fights that we had in Afghanistan. It's up against the Pakistani border. It's sandwiched in between Nuristan and Nangarhar. It's a tough place to be a commander and to be successful in stabilization. If you want to see a little bit more about that, there's an excellent documentary out there called The Hornet's Nest, which, as the name implies, was a tough fight. He's featured in it personally with his great battalion, and it's worth taking a look at. John, when I retired from the Marine Corps in 2013, I never thought I would be concerned over these matters again, or mentioned in a SIG report. But 18 months later, I found myself the special presidential envoy to the global coalition to counter the so-called Islamic State. And with the onslaught of ISIS, we had no real idea how this fight would ultimately take shape, but the one thing we did know was that we would eventually have a massive stabilization effort, not just to rescue the populations, but to keep out Daesh or ISIS in the aftermath. But it was going to be big. It was going to be big across both Iraq and Syria. With that in mind, and given the lessons that you were already surfacing from the Afghan experience, as you well remember, we worked to set up a network of inspectors general from the very beginning of this, which we think was really essential to these kinds of events, which would look hard at U.S. and coalition efforts as they were unfolding to get the most out of the work that we were doing. So already, John, you and your team have had an effect on a future crisis that we would be involved in. So what I'd like to do is we'll have a few minutes of questions. I'll ask a couple, then we'll go to the audience for a couple. And these are going to be forward-looking. The report obviously speaks for itself. There's a lot of detail in there about the deficiencies and the challenges that John and his team were able to see and to document. But this isn't the end for the United States and for coalitions. Already, as my remarks implied, within 18 months of supposedly the end of the conflict in Afghanistan, we're now embroiled once again in something in Iraq and in Syria, and it will continue, and it will continue. And we need to profit and benefit from the work that you have done and others to ensure that we're better prepared as we go. So again, thinking about the future, John, at either in let's just call it a hypothetical administration of the future, we have a crisis. It is one where we have the capacity, not as a result of an emergency, which is Afghanistan, but we have the capacity for some deliberate thought about how we will be involved in this evolution, how we will intervene, or how we will be invited in, and how long we'll be there, and what we think the issues will be. You've been summoned to the White House because of your work to advise the President and his national security team on what they should be thinking about right now as the United States contemplates yet another effort which could result in a large stabilization effort. If I could ask, what will you tell the President? Keeping, of course, in mind that you'll probably be hired the minute that you're done talking. But please, what would you tell the President? 2 or 3 things.
Well, the first thing, and General, you and I chatted about this in the green room before we came, is get your staff to read the lessons learned reports that are already out there. I mean, that was one of the things you discovered to your chagrin when you were leading a team that you had no blueprint, no lessons learned, and then you found a USAID report out there which actually helped you. Reports have been written. I mean, we discovered that in Afghanistan, that there was an excellent report done by USAID on USAID's involvement from 1950 till late 70s. And we found that report, and it laid out a lot of the issues that we were finding right now, but no one had ever read it. We couldn't find anybody in the embassy or USAID who had actually seen it. So the first thing is read what's been out there. The military will have done lessons learned. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the state and aid do lessons learned, and do they incorporate it into their training, teaching, et cetera. The second thing is, before you go in, know where you're going into. Mm-hmm. As a military commander, you know you have to know the terrain. Well, that applies to stabilization also. Mm-hmm. Know how and why the people in that region supported the terrorist groups. What was the issue or the issues they were doing? I think in Afghanistan, we decided to duplicate Norway in each one of these districts. We tried to provide schools, highways, et cetera, et cetera. What we should have looked at is what were the services that the Taliban and the terrorists and the insurgents providing, which made the people relatively happy. You don't have to give them everything at start. The other thing is do it incrementally. And the other thing I would tell the president is, despite your inclination to do it quickly, announce a success, and declare victory, sue for peace, go home, it's going to take a long time. Let's be realists about this. Let's be honest to the American people and to the American Congress that none of these things can be done quickly and successfully. So those would be some of my advice.
Okay, so the president is dutifully impressed with this, and then lays the bombshell on you that we always expect these days, and that is this is going to be a coalition effort. It's not just the United States. So, Mr. Sopko, please advise the President of the United States on how he or she should be thinking about how a community of nations effort for a stabilization effort might be considered, because as you know, we had 50 nations engaged in the coalition in Afghanistan.
And all 50 nations were sometimes going at cross purposes to each other. That's one of the most difficult.
How do we solve that? Or how do we think about it in ways that reduce the fratricide?
Well, first of all, we have to realize that we're dealing with our coalition allies, all are sovereign nations. They have their own political reasons for doing what they're doing. They all have parliaments or congresses that their officials, their generals have to respond to. So you're never going to eliminate the fact that every country has their own prerequisites, their own, foibles, you may want to call it. They probably view ours the same. So knowing that, let's assume the Germans cannot go into a certain area. Take that into consideration. It's not a fault of the German parliament, or they got a restriction, or the Japanese have a restriction on using. Realize that and come up with a plan that utilizes each one of those countries' best capabilities. So that's the first thing. We have to be humble enough to realize that every other country is like ours. They got political answers they have to come to. The other thing, General, is if you know you're going to have a coalition approach, realize that what's promised isn't always what's delivered. And I think you probably faced that with NATO. You'd go out and recruit the troops. The NATO promised X thousands, but it turned out that only half showed up. How do you then go forward with that hole in your approach? And I think that's something to take into consideration.
Okay, you're hired. Get packed. One of the things that was an issue associated with Afghanistan, which I experienced in Iraq and we've experienced elsewhere, is, and I think you've touched on this, how should we be thinking about both the stabilization and ultimately the reconstruction effort, because they should blend. One should lead logically to the other, and sometimes they can go on concurrently, in order to avoid creating additional burdens to the host nation. Because as you well know, and again, we're forward-looking, we did leave quite a bill for the Afghans each year for the maintenance of roads and infrastructure and buildings, et cetera. How should we be thinking about that?
I think first, just thinking about that is important. I don't think we did think about it that much, particularly on the civilian side. And part of it was a problem, I think, that comes back here to Washington. We tend to think in appropriation cycles. Maybe we all think that way. We get an appropriation cycle, it's 1 year, 2 year money. We have to show success to justify it. If we don't spend it, we lose it. And that is the problem. I've commented before, I think you and I have had a conversation, it's not that anyone we sent to Afghanistan was not as smart and not as brave and not as honorable.
Right.
We gave them a box of broken tools. We gave them a personnel system that was broken, a procurement system that was broken. Your rotational system that you had to face was broken. How you could get the people you wanted and have them stay long enough was broken. We need to look at those issues first. And I do agree with you about the Afghans, and I feel bad when I go over and talk to the Afghans and we are putting new conditions on the Afghans. But we realize that all of the coalition are also putting new conditions, and they're not coordinated. And each one of the aid programs from all the various countries have their own requirements, documents that have to be filled out, meetings that have to be made. And you wonder sometimes, what's the Afghans be thinking on their side? Here comes another guy who's going to help me, and another burden that I'm putting on them. And I think if we could somehow get the allies together to think on a common platform, let's not overwhelm the Afghans with filling out paper, paper reform. The Paper Reduction Act, which we passed years ago here in the United States, we ought to apply to our coalition development.
I think that to your point, the personnel rotation processes of all of the agencies, and you used the term broken, I would perhaps use different terms, but they were certainly challenging. Remembering that while units came in for a year at a time, and they didn't always come in at the same time, there was overlap and echeloning of units in and out. We've often heard that this war was fought, this 14, 15, 16-year war, 1 year at a time. And I think many of the rotational issues, had they been better coordinated from the beginning across all of the interagency and across all of the coalition partners, could have given us an operational perspective and a longevity of operational perspective, which would have been helpful. In my first meeting with Hamid Karzai as the new commander, he pointed out to me that I was the fourth four-star general commanding Afghanistan in 4 years for him. This just creates our own institutional inertias that make this very difficult.
Yeah.
So we have 15 minutes left on this session. What I'd like to do is, again, thank Mr. Sopko for his answers to my questions and for his remarks. Let's go out to the audience for a couple. I will ask when you get the microphone. I will, in about 30 seconds after you get the microphone, be looking for a question in what you're saying. And we'll move very quickly to that question if I don't see it. So this gentleman right here in the front, and then I'll come over across the aisle.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak here today. My name's Jonathan, and I'm a student.
Please identify. Yeah, you're about to do that. As you introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from, please. Thanks. Go ahead, Jonathan.
So I'm wondering.
From where?
From Connecticut, and I'll be at OSD this summer in their East Asia office.
Good for you.
But I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit about Pakistan, because I think Pakistan has been a key variable that has impeded any success or stabilization efforts. And so moving forward with our stabilization approach with Afghanistan, what type of approach should we take with Pakistan?
Can I just quickly answer that? And I'm going to defer to the general here. I look at just Afghanistan and just reconstruction. Pakistan's obviously an important player. The new strategy from the administration has a key component on Pakistan. But I'm going to defer to the general because I think you spent a lot more time dealing with the Pakistan issue than I did. So I'm sorry, I'm not avoiding it. It's just I don't do Pakistan. So, General, yeah.
I'll just give you 30 seconds. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan is not divorced from the relationship of Pakistan from Afghanistan. And getting the Pakistanis to see that their vested interests over the long term are best served by a stable Afghanistan, one that does not, in fact, benefit from the Haqqanis or from other Taliban elements, is in their long-term best interests. There was a long time when I believed that peace in Afghanistan passed through Islamabad and Rawalpindi. In many respects, I think the long-term stability of Pakistan passes not just through Islamabad and Rawalpindi, but it also passes through Kabul as well. So getting the Pakistanis, the Afghans, and the international community to have a similar view that a stable Afghanistan, one that has the capacity both for governmental stability, security to the population, and very importantly, a viable, reinvigorated economy, is not just important to Afghanistan, it's important to the long-term stability of Pakistan as well. Thank you for that question. Coming over here. Gentlemen, yes, sir. In the shirt, please.
Thank you. General, first I'd like to thank you for your comments. I'm a retired FSO and a Vietnam veteran.
Yes, sir.
And thank you very much.
Thank you for your service.
My name is Jack Siegel, and I was the poll lad for NATO from 2002 to 2010 and made frequent trips to Afghanistan. When you began the discussion, you said that stabilization is keeping insurgents from returning. And in my conversations with General Carter, General Richards, even General Nicholson, I got an impression that in places like Nowzad and Kunar and Musakala, the insurgents never left, that they just went underground when we went there, that they were simply part of the society. So if the objective is stabilization, have we picked out the wrong target?
That's a good question. Maybe by saying they always stay, I think what we're indicating is that this problem is an Afghan problem. And it's not like the people are going to run back to Pakistan. But when the area or district is unstable, those people, or whatever the terrorist group is, have to be taken out of the way, eliminated in one fashion. So if they decide to go underground, or they decide to join a reconciliation group and become part of the government, that's another way. But you have to provide a service which in many of these districts they provided. And that's part of the idea, is creating a central government that can run Afghanistan and have government control over a region so it doesn't become a hotbed for other terrorist activities. And can I just add one thing, General, also?
Sure, please.
We keep referring to Pakistan as being the key problem. The problem also, as we saw in this report, was that the Afghan government at times was viewed very negatively by their local people. And what you really need is to insert a government that the people support, a government that is not predatory, a government that isn't a bunch of lawless warlords. And that is a key thing. And that was one of the things I didn't talk about, but I'm certain the panel will talk about. When we poured so much money into these unstable environments, we contributed to that problem of creating more warlords, more powerful people who basically took the law into their own hands. So in essence, the government we introduced, particularly some of the Afghan local police forces, which were nothing other than warlord militias with some uniforms on, were just as bad as the terrorists that were there before.
Let me add to this. If I were also summoned with him that day to the White House, one of the things that I would tell the president is something that we learned not just in Afghanistan, we had seen it somewhat in Iraq, but we really saw it in Colombia, is that some days there's a distinction without a difference between the insurgent and the criminal patronage networks. And I don't think we got a full grip on that in Afghanistan. In my mind, there was a triangular threat to Afghanistan's future, but also in a military context. You had the ideological insurgency, which we would euphemistically call the Taliban. You had the drug enterprise, which fueled an awful lot of insurgent and criminal behavior. And then you had the criminal patronage networks. And I don't believe we were properly organized, frankly, to deal with that. So if again, the president were to ask me my views on how we get ready to go, my first comment to the president would be, you must assume that there will be an inherent, sometimes inextricable link between criminality and corruption and the insurgency. And you've got to give the civilian agencies and you've got to give the military commander capacity to bring to bear law enforcement and drug enforcement capabilities in the right numbers to assist in the dealing with the insurgency. If we're not properly mixed that way, we'll fool ourselves into believing we've defeated the Taliban in a particular area, only to find out that now we got the criminal patronage networks to work in. They're deeply embedded in the society, and they're well fueled with the drug enterprise. So we have to be thinking in those multidimensional ways. We'll take 2 more questions, this gentleman over here, and then Professor Maddox on the right. Yes, sir.
My name is Jeff Stacy. I used to work for Ambassador John Herbst at SCRS CSO.
Sure.
And have spent a few years now doing global development consulting. My company has done more projects in Afghanistan than anywhere else. I'll be headed back there on a UN contract in just a couple of weeks. My first question has to do with maybe one of the elephants in the room, which are the Afghans themselves. I imagine that you gentlemen and a lot of people here might agree with something, an observation along these lines, that we've all met a lot of Afghans who are actually pretty darn good, who are well-traveled, who speak a lot of languages, who have great skills, and a lot of them are young. And if they could only get the leaders at the top of their organizations, who do tend to be corrupt from their own complaints, out of the way, there's a lot of capacity already there in Kabul and other cities in Afghanistan to make use of. My first question is, would you agree with that? The second has to do with the donors, Mr. Sopko, that you mentioned toward the end of your remarks. I remember meeting some EU police folks working on a long-standing project the EU's had on police, and they obviously had to spend most of their time coordinating with the U.S., a much bigger police training program. Their observations are very much in sync with yours, and they've been there for years. Some of the additional complaints that they would make were that while they were seasoned detectives and essentially sergeants and captains and what have you, their American counterparts were very young, were hired from all over the U.S., didn't have a lot of training. And then, of course, we got into, if we're honest with ourselves, a period of a kind of militarization of our police training. And that was something that the EU was very sensitive to. And one last thing about the EU.
Quickly, please, sir.
Yep.
Quickly.
The question is, they set up a project in Kosovo, Pristina, where they actually set up built a justice ministry. And the adjoining office with every top official there had an EU advisor. So the question is, given that the EU doesn't have a great reputation in this town, and even more so since the election, are we also able to learn lessons from some of our allies and friends? And even, you brought up at the end, even you said, what if donors are all there and we're putting on contingencies and things, who coordinates all that? Is it always the U.S. because we fund the most and we have the biggest presence, or should it be the UN on occasion?
First, to your question about the Afghans, my personal experience is they are a remarkable people. And while I met a few that I'd probably want to detain from time to time, the vast, vast majority of the Afghans, from the most senior, the most modern, to the most traditional, were extraordinarily admirable people. I've got great commitment ultimately to them till I take my last breath. With respect to the EU, when I was the commander there, which is getting to be a few years ago, but I think I can speak pretty knowledgeably about it, I felt that the EU was a good partner for us. They did good work. And in some areas where, as you remember, I'm sure you're committed or familiar with this, we had provincial reconstruction teams that were nationally owned. And so there were some limitations, and John used the term, or I'll use the term, caveats. There were some national caveats associated with stabilization, where there were sometimes gaps in between what the Hungarians might be doing or the Germans might be doing. The EU worked, frankly, very hard to try to fill in those gaps. And the EU remains, I think, a credible player. Now, is it the perfect outcome? We can all do better. But the EU has been a good partner, I think, for us in this regard. And we may have a different opinion in some places in Washington, but I think the EU will be an important partner, and the UN will continue to be an important partner. And I think when we look at the post-ISIL campaign, what we'll discover is one of the heroes of that is a woman by the name of Lise Grande in the UNDP. And we were able to put together a stabilization fund which came in immediately behind the clearing of Tikrit or Ramadi or someplace like that, where we were able to put stabilization funding in immediately, ultimately to achieve the rescue of the population, to create the environment where the insurgents could not or would not want to come back in. So the UN is a great partner. It has to be the right moment for them. The EU is a great partner. We should bring in their strengths and play to their strengths and recognize that they'll have caveats as well. This is a matter, as John said, this is a matter of ultimately us having the capacity for strategic planning in this regard and not try to put it together on the ground. It's too late when you put it together on the ground. You're going to have to live with the inefficiencies of that. And if there's anything you'd like to add on the donors,
I agree with
and then we'll come to Professor
agree with the
Maddox.
general. And the one thing I would add about the youth in Afghanistan, I view them as sort of the canary in the coal mine. As long as the current government is still surrounded by these young, honest, honorable, well-educated, and they're taking a lot of risk, supporting the government. And I meet with the president almost every time I go there. I see his top advisors. As long as we see them, I feel good. I feel optimistic. When they disappear, then we got some problems. So I agree with that. And we issued a report, the prior lessons learned report on security sector assistance, where we talked about in great detail the whole issue of police training. And that was one of the problems we saw. We're sending too many of U.S. military helicopter pilots and other people to do police training. We should have police doing that. So I just add that.
And one final point. Yeah. When we're in the room and evaluating or advising the President of the United States, one of the key pieces of advice we must give that individual is the process of stabilization has to leverage the full potential of the women of that civilization, the women of that culture. We have to support their aspect in civil society, their role within the stabilization, and those efforts that can capitalize on that and leverage it will accelerate the role of women in the society, but also leverage one of the most powerful influences in the society as well. And so let me go to Professor Maddox, please. And this will be the last question we'll have on this panel, and then we'll break and then go into the regular panel.
Gail Maddox from the U.S. Naval Academy. Very interesting. I'll leave this short because it does dovetail well the previous question and some of your answers, but that is just to take the comments on coalitions a little bit further.
Good.
How do we actually accomplish then addressing those problems with the coalition? Do we do that at NATO? Do we do it, does the UN take it on? Does the United States take it on? What do you suggest that we learn these lessons, and where and how do we do that?
You take it?
Do you want to jump?
Go ahead, please.
Okay.
I'll jump in right behind.
Well, I think on our security sector assistance lessons learned report that came out, we talk about having to take that into consideration early on with the coalition. Now, that was just in the security sector. We have not, either in this report or in our lessons learned report, I think, on private sector development, really looked at that issue yet. That's something, we have a lessons learned report called Divided Responsibilities that we're working on right now, which tries to look at that whole issue of responsibilities and authorities, and it's sort of that gap between them. So I don't have a better answer than that. I know as a practitioner you had to deal with this on a daily basis. So.
Sure. Let's go to the ISIL campaign again. That was an ad hoc coalition in which NATO had an interest, and NATO was formally a partner, as was the EU. We're going to have to be organized, quickly organized diplomatically to determine where those priorities are and establish those priorities within that coalition. And just as a matter of, I think, importance, ad hoc coalitions can only get you so far for a certain period of time. And from the moment you form an ad hoc coalition, you need to be thinking about who you're going to hand this off to if you don't accomplish the mission within the period of time envisaged for that coalition. So it might be that a coalition will get handed off to NATO for the security purposes and handed off to the EU for stabilization purposes. But I will tell you, as we began to build the counter-ISIL coalition, we had 5 lines of effort. I won't take you through the other 4, but one of the earliest of the 5 lines of effort we established early along, and Germany and the Emirates took the lead on the planning within that line of effort, was stabilization, the rescuing of liberated populations. And so from the very beginning of the counter-ISIL effort, stabilization was important to us. We envisaged we had more capacity to do it in Iraq. That was the first part of the fight. We also had a government we could deal with. It was much more difficult, and I think we have one of the panelists who will address this. It was much more difficult to undertake coherent stabilization in Syria. And so we have to think about areas where we would conduct stabilization where we're either in opposition to the central government or the central government can't reach into that area. We have to have flexibility in that regard. But the grand strategic meeting of the nations has to occur early along in the process, whether it's a U.S.-called coalition, as this one was, or it's a NATO-led coalition or a UN coalition. That process of early leadership to determine from the very beginning as it begins, where stabilization plays in that process. It cannot be an afterthought. It can't be something we start to think about as we finally cleared the first village. It's got to be something we think about from the very beginning. And so I'm sorry we went over just a couple of minutes. My apologies to the next panel. John, thank you for your comments. Thank you for your contribution this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, help me to thank our friend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.